Welcome to this Fane online event between myself, Caleb Azumah Nelson, and Khashayar Khabushani. I'm really excited to be here with you with this book, with this beautiful novel that as I was saying, I got multiple novels of in the house. I Will Greet the Sun again. I read this novel. When did I read it first? It was the first novel I actually read after I finished writing Small Worlds. I don't know if you know that. And I'd like
Wow.
my brain was doing that strange thing where it's not taking anything in. And I was on holiday, and Isabel, our editor, had passed me a proof, and she was like, "You have to. This is the one you have to read. You have to read it." She was so right. It's such a beautiful, beautiful novel, and just the so much packed into 200 pages. I'm really grateful that we can be having this exchange.
I appreciate that, Caleb, and it's so interesting the I guess the serendipity. I don't know if that's the right word, but in hearing you say that because it was last year when you read it, which would have been before it goes into copy edits, and you're familiar with that process
Yeah,
and how
yeah.
that goes. And what's so beautiful about what you shared is you had read it after finishing Small Worlds, right? And I I had finished it. I had read your book after I had finished. It was the first book I read after I finished copy edits.
Oh
You know,
man,
like
beautiful. Look at that.
because like copy edits is its own thing. You know,
Yeah.
it's like one thing to go through revision, and then you and it's more like technical and could it uses a part of my brain that I'm not very familiar with. And I was like, I need something to just like get me back into the flow of words. And Isabel's like, I've got the exact thing for you.
Perfect, man. Perfect serendipity right there. Oh man. Your novel's been out for what day is it today? It's Monday. So for a handful of days over on these sides. How you feeling?
Caleb, here in the States, yeah, I've done two book events now. I did one in San Francisco. I guess like to your point, yeah, it hasn't been a week since the book's been out, but I did an event in San Francisco, and then did one in Los Angeles, which is where I grew up, and we had such a massive turnout of people, people from grade school, former professors, friends, and also unfamiliar faces that I was meeting for the first time. And it you you hope and you look forward to the day when it's going to be published for so long, and then it arrives. And to answer your question very truthfully, I have no idea how I'm doing or how I'm feeling because it's just such a whirlwind. I'm just like trying to process what in the heck is going on, and also doing my best to like hold the book, go through the pages, and be like, oh my goodness, like this story, these voices, these characters, they are binded together in this book that I will forever get to like revisit and drop into. And that brings me so much joy because um that was part of the engine of why I wanted to write this book, because I as a young person I didn't think a story like this would ever get to exist, in the way that this particular one is told.
I wondered actually where the novel, like in this version at least, because I know there are so many versions that before you get to the time that you sit down. But I wondered where and when this version of this novel had started for you. What were the kind of inception points and the initial intentions for you?
It's so this sort of this beautiful journey that I went on because the voice of Kay, I remember very clearly as a young person, as a boy, even 9 years old and then 12 years old, like when I was experiencing my mom going through the hardships that she was going through, working multiple shifts, and I would sleep on the floor in her room, and I would just sort of, and at the time, like I was getting into a lot of trouble and getting kicked out of school and failing courses, and then I would look at her and see how hard she was working, and familiar with her story of leaving Iran, coming to the States, everything that happened between her and my father, and I started narrating, and it even gets me choked up right now to think about it, because I started narrating what was happening, like, with as much detail as possible, because that was sort of the most comfort as a young person that I could provide for myself. Now you fast forward and you come of age, you go to university. I taught middle school for a minute, and then went to my MFA, and
Mm.
I tried an entirely different voice and diction and all of those things that we learn from great writers. That it's like, I've learned it's one thing to admire a writer, and a very different thing to turn to them to find your own voice. And what I was doing is I was trying to emulate writers that I admired and still do, but it took
Mhm.
me a minute to recognize, like, no, that the voice that I need is actually already here. I just need to have the courage to be like, it's all right to write from a young person's point of view, to write with, like, simple, stripped down language.
Mm. I think there was this real, for me, like your voice on the page was the first thing that leapt up. It was this real confidence, I think. And I think when you're talking about this notion of voice and finding your own voice, it really is about going towards yourself in a way.
Mm,
The
mm,
things that are kind of like lying within yourself. I was actually thinking in the first sort of section of the novel, when Kay is running down towards the water,
mm,
and makes his way down, and you keep mentioning this notion of quiet. And
mm.
whenever I think of quiet, it's a very different thing from silence. It's really this kind of
Wow.
like space where, like, all of these desires that we have, our innermost thoughts and feelings and emotions, are allowed to be given this little voice. And sometimes the voice gets louder and louder, and sometimes it emerges. And I wondered how the things that you were thinking and feeling, and all of, like, the quiet in you, how that was able to be manifest throughout the novel, and how that also shifted across the narrative as you were writing.
Wow, man, it gives me the chills, because you're spot on. I was like, I literally was just describing this to somebody about the the valley in Los Angeles, which is the way I viewed it as a young person. Like, your point about the difference between quiet and silence. The way I viewed it is like, it's a place where um, it seems nothing is happening because it's so sprawling. And there's a kind of like quietness that the hot sun, the dry hot sun could bring in the summertime. And yeah, it's very different from silence, as you said. And so on one hand, there's what I felt nothing was happening, and yet everything is happening within that quiet. And so trying to, like, dig into that and bring that to the page. And I think one way that really came to be for me is particularly with that scene that you're talking about, where they're running down the cliff to the ocean. Is And this is something, of course, like, what I fell in love with your writing about it, and is like the rhythm of it. Is like, you can take something that's quiet, but if you invoke it with rhythm, suddenly there's like this drum beat that's going, and all of a sudden it's not so quiet anymore.
Yeah, I think, well, I've never been to LA. I've always wanted
Mm,
to. I eventually must, but I think that whenever I was trying to kind of make this image of the space in my mind's eye, using your words, there was this real kind of like languid nature
mm,
to this space, and that sense of quiet, and also like this feeling of a space just stretching up and outwards, and feeling like there was just so much that might be possible. Um, Especially in those times where the sun is shining, and there's all of this rhythm that's being made by these brothers and their friends. But then also there are these times where the shimmer of the space kind of dies down, and night might
yep.
fall. Um, and I wondered, I guess, like, about that space, the setting of LA, and how it influenced your work.
Yeah, I've heard several writers talk about, and I'll sort of contrast. Los Angeles in relation to your question to New York and New York City, and I've heard
Mhm.
some writers talk about how New York City, like whether you're writing a story or a novel that takes place in New York, or if you're simply or if you're living there, it has this baked in context and narrative that sort of fills in those gaps. And as somebody that lived in New York City, I certainly felt that, and that was like what was such a big joy of it is I didn't have to bring context into it. Like, of course, I'm going to bring my sense of self, but it was a comfort to have it provided for me. Whereas in my experience in Los Angeles, like both living there and definitely writing about it, um, I didn't feel that there is, and I should say specifically the part of the valley that I grew up in, I didn't feel that there was a baked in narrative. Certainly, um, people that brought their stories, and especially first generation immigrants or immigrants themselves. There's all kinds of storytelling that's happening, but you sort of have to, like, if you're fortunate enough to be a part of those communities, then it opens up to you. But it's, whereas like in New York, walk down walk down the walk up, go onto the stoop, and I'm like in conversation with six different people by the time I get to the coffee shop. Not so much in LA. You gotta have a car and all these things. So um it I that's why um I feel in this novel, for me, the characters that are growing up around Kay, and then also the characters in Iran
Mhm.
are so important because they are almost like they're contributing to his voice and his storytelling as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think that this sort of, I don't know, LA for me just felt like it had that from in it, that kind of an engine of something
Mhm.
larger than yourself, you know? Um, and I think actually in the first section, there is that feeling of like growth, of coming out of yourself or trying to come out of yourself. Um, and then that's really contrasted in the space in which the brothers are taken to Iraq. And actually, in the first few pages, I really just confronted with this very, very different space and things that they can't even possibly have like they weren't even thinking that this is what they were going towards. And I guess I wondered about the juxtaposition of those two different spaces of
Yeah,
Iran and
that
LA and that kind of like early arrival at least.
yeah, I think that's yeah, like that was part of the heartbreak. I mean, in addition to so many other things of Kay and his brothers being taken from Los Angeles, like of course being taken from their mother, and it happening in such an abrupt way, and in such a violent way. Um, but in addition to that, to your point, like in the first part of the book, he's able, especially when we think of like queerness, but also his confusion about his Iranianness, and yet his obsession with Americanness and wanting to be known as an American boy. He's sort of beginning to come into that and showcasing this courage to do it. Uh, and then and then the boys are taken. And to your point, like the moment they arrive, I kind of, as an outsider looking in at the book and looking at that transition, I can see it as the country of Iran, the people of Iran, that experience in the novel. It looks, it's like telling Kay, yeah, you've been having your like early coming of age. Doesn't matter. That's like, now like we're gonna tell you who you need to be in this context. Like, and especially with the political context and everything that's going on. But what really moved me about those portions is he still kind of finds a way to like continue his American coming of age, even within Iran.
I think there was this kind of quiet defiance from Kay throughout the novel, but actually in particular in that part where even in the times where he couldn't quite articulate what he was feeling, the emotion would still rise up. It was like the emotion was still leading him to these different spaces. There, I was thinking a lot of the time that they're in the I don't think, I can't exactly remember what it was called, but they're in the back of a kind of like taxi or and they're being
Yeah,
taken around and he's
a carriage
hungry.
with a horse. Yeah,
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 he's
yeah.
hungry. And so his like expression is like, I want to say I'm hungry. Like it's a very base level thing, but at its root, there's something really beautiful about him being able to feel something and go towards that. And I wondered, I don't know, I kept thinking about this. I kept thinking about the ways in which we're intimate with ourselves. And I wondered about
Mm,
like that journey that Kay takes throughout the novel, like how he's able to meander towards this intimacy with himself and towards beginning to know himself as such.
wow. Yeah. Yeah. Well, to that scene in particular, when they're at the Naqsh Jahan Square and they're being sort of taken around, yeah, this back of this carriage, and Kay is like you say, he's feeling hungry and he's feeling unsettled. I mean, experiencing all kinds of emotions, and the by the time it gets to the end of the sort of the loop around the square, the driver offers to have extends an invitation, says, "Have have you boys eaten? We'd love to have you." Um, and there's this kind of, we call it ta'aruf in Iranian culture, which is somebody will offer something, but they're doing it out of politeness. They don't really want to actually host you over. And so to like that defiance, Kay's like, yeah, 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 we'll come over for sure. Like I'm hungry. And that kind of um that contrast of, rather than being uh, let's say more assimilated with the mores and the cultures of the place, and saying like, that's that nakone, thank you so much, but we're fine. He announces those things, and I think that kind of falls into alignment with that defiance that you pointed out.
I wanted to talk a bit about intimacy, and actually first and foremost the brothers, this
Mm,
sibling intimacy that appears on the page and how so much of their shared it's always just really interesting to me when you see siblings rendered on the page because growing up in the same house, you're all having the same experiences, but the convergences and divergences of your various identities and desires are so vast. And I wondered also about this notion of responsibility and roles that siblings occupy
mm,
and how much those
mm,
roles shift and slip. I think Kay is the youngest, but there are so many moments in which he comes out of that role and comes out of himself. I was thinking of him making quesadilla
mm,
for his
mm.
oldest brothers, and just like a kind of like the small intimacies that they share. And I just wondered how important it was for you to have this sibling relationship on the page.
I think I'll be, like reflecting on this because I've got in my own private life, I've got two older brothers, and in my personal life, I should say, and I I was just reflecting this on the other night, like what is one's responsibility? I think the um the assumption that I've slipped into in the past is that there's a hierarchy.
Mhm.
Oldest brother is responsible for being a protector, setting an example, being a role model, all those things, and it sort of goes down the line. And yet, I don't think that that's very fair, um, especially if you are in a household where uh, things uh, needs aren't being met. If there's violence, if there's abuse, if there's neglect, like whatever it may be, it is unfair to say, well, therefore the eldest has to step in. In my opinion, and I say that because the eldest is also enduring those things, and having to come to terms with it. And so in the book, I I try to really have fluidity with that, where at times, Sean, who's the eldest, he is kind of having that eldest brother role. But then in other times, like you said, Kay being the youngest, when Justin's going through a really hard time in the last act of the book, it's Kay who steps up. But then even in that moment, he's like, making him a quesadilla, bringing it to his bed, and then Justin slips into like older brother role of like, this is what you need to know about, sex and
Yeah.
being respectful, like all
Yeah.
those things.
Yeah.
So I really, what I did, I just kind of, I tried to let them talk and get out of the way rather than bringing my own assumptions and beliefs, which, it's not going to be perfect. Like it's almost, I don't know if there is any writer who's able to remove themselves entirely from fiction, and if they are, I admire the heck out of them. But for me, it was like this constant thing of just being like, Justin, Sean, Kay, they're in the scene together. Listen to them and let them tell you what's going
Mhm.
on, what they're feeling.
Sean was one of my favorite characters
That makes
in
me
the
so
novel.
happy
Just
to
as
hear. I
yeah, just
love
the kind
that.
of like I'm the oldest in my family, and I
Ah,
just
okay, there you
recognize
go. There
so
you
much of myself in Sean.
go.
Just in that kind of like
So
the
as the
his
eldest
real
brother, Caleb, you weren't pissed off at Kay, like when you were reading
no
Sean.
no no no
You're like, you
no.
being a freaking brat, man. Get it together.
I think there's something so beautiful about even in the times that Shauna is like yo, like what are you doing? Because it's because it's a form of care. It is a kind of there's a way in which even if it doesn't quite come through the right channels, there is this again that notion of responsibility that Sean takes on where he's just like, man, like
Mm,
let's do this. Let's try this or like like so much of it is a sense of even in the moments where they're really tussling and really fighting there is this
oh yeah. Oh
yeah
yeah.
he really asked himself ask Kay he's like are you good now are you okay like
Mm,
there are so many moments that happens where we're even within the kind of tussle that Sean is still trying to care for his younger brother in the ways that he knows how to.
yeah. Yeah. Caleb, one of my favorite, I probably for, if I'm lucky enough to do to continue writing for the rest of my life, I have a feeling that one of my favorite scenes that I have ever written is where they're all sitting on the sofa they're watching a Lakers game, and in particular they're watching Shaq and Kobe win their first championship together for the Los Angeles Lakers. And the reason it was one of my favorite chapters to I grew up playing ball, and like I talk about rhythm,
Yeah.
and just like thinking of both my experience with basketball, but then seeing Kobe, seeing Shaq, seeing the rest of the NBA players do their thing. But to what you said about Sean, like the part that really there's this like great, um, and this happened in real life, and I remember as a little boy seeing, so embarrassing I could start crying talking about basketball. What does that say about me? But where Kobe leaps into Shaq's arms, and
Yeah.
and in the novel, when that happens and they're watching that on screen, Sean turns to his two younger brothers and is like,
Mhm.
that could be us. Like
Yeah.
we can go, which has its element of fantasy, of course,
Mhm.
and the boys are certainly so far removed from what that reality, all those things. But I think it's the gesture for
Mhm.
Sean saying,
Mhm.
like, looping in something that's happening um, outside of their apartment complex, outside of their world, and tying it back to their
Yes.
lives. I
Yeah.
was so moved by that.
I think I'm a huge Lakers fan and have been all my life. So I was sat there like reading this and just whoever has managed to experience this in real time, I'm so jealous. So jealous. But I also think as I was reading, there were so many beautiful instances of not just the people playing basketball, but of the rhythm and the space that it creates. I think that there's a basketball in itself is a very for me has always just been like a really beautiful thing because I grew up playing basketball as well. And
Mm,
it's this real sense of there's this real sense of presence that takes place when you are playing, where for the moment that it takes to try and hit a jump shot, the rest of the world falls away. Like you have to be within your body to the highest degree. You have to forget about what has come before and what might come. It's just only a moment in which you're trying to reach towards your desire. And I think that you found so many times I found this where even in Sean, like walking up and down, if he doesn't get all the way down to the court, dribbling the ball through his legs, then he's starting again. Just this notion of focus and presence that really ran through the novel. And I thought, yeah, that was just for me, that was beautiful.
Yeah, and it's and I was, because to this day, like, I'll go and I'll hoop with some buddies,
Mhm.
and I marvel at the, to use a canned term, like, the intersection of, let's say, me as wanting to be uh an artist, and being queer, and then
Mhm.
stepping on the court,
Mhm.
and it's like, oh, I also get to fall into this, more, not always, but what will come up is like this kind of aggressive energy, this very like masculine energy that I don't always feel in my personal life, off the
Mhm.
court. Um, and I think for the, especially, the like the body, the contact that sport offers, which can be very violent. Of course, I don't want to minimize that.
Mhm.
But to bring it to Sean and Kay, especially when we think about like what they have gone through in Iran and their early life, when they step onto the court, it almost provides a language. And again, if even in moments where it does end, become violent, that's their way of both processing and like talking about,
Yeah.
what's gone on.
Yeah. I think I was really struck by those moments where characters bump up against each other and where there is this physicality. And I think that there are so many moments where characters are touching or holding or bumping, but there are also these moments where there is just this real electric thrill where like characters are almost touching or can't quite at the point of touching can't quite convert that into something more, can't quite manifest exactly what they're feeling. And this there's this constant pull. I think a lot of the relationship between Kay and Johnny, and it's just
Mm,
like this constant pull between them, and where they're not always, neither of them actually able always to articulate how they are feeling, but it just keeps rising up. And I wondered about that notion of desire and attraction, and specifically the intersection with queerness and being
mm.
young and queer and coming into that and not always having the language for it, but still feeling those things.
Wow. Yep. 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 It brings to mind. I'm it brings to mind what James Baldwin said in regards to this, and I'm pulling it out of context. So pardon me, but what he says is, if you erode a person's sexuality or their chance to have a relationship with their sexuality, then you take away their ability to love. And I think for Kay, um, what you described is like those moments where there is, desire and touch, or like leading to the point of touch. I think it's both this instance where he wants more. He definitely wants to be sexually intimate with Johnny, and at the same time, um, like getting to see Johnny on the staircase at the apartment complex, like sitting in the rain, like with his, with his mouth open and just taking it in, and like Kay
Yes.
being beside him, even if they aren't touching, the kind of energy that exists in
Mhm.
that dynamic, I think is enough for Kay to say, I have, this is me experiencing my desire or my sexuality. Again, like, not to the extent that he ultimately wants, but I think it's because of the chance to be in proximity to Johnny is what ultimately gives him the chance to love, as to go back to the Baldwin quote. And
Mhm.
that also kind of ties back into your question about Los Angeles, which
Mhm.
is like Kay seeing that outside the apartment complex, or even within the apartment complex, there may not be much going on.
Mm.
It's like you could sit next to Johnny on the staircase, and like you
Mm.
could listen to what he has to say, and you can share what you have to say, and that builds on each other.
There's something I remember just underlining that scene in my one of my copies that I think I've since given away, but thinking about like this notion of like the ecstatic, like this kind
Mm,
of like feeling of a disappearance of that like first line of yourself and just like
mm,
real sense of presence. Um, it really it that scene actually really made me think of the ways in which religion and faith appear in the novel and
mm,
how
mm,
so much of there's this real tussle and tension between a traditional religious experience and the feeling of faith, of beyondness, of feeling something more than yourself. And I think there are these glimpses, these intimacies, these ecstatic moments that occur where you can feel that Kay just believes in so much more than himself. And I
mm.
wondered if you could speak on that tension between religion and faith in the novel.
I so appreciate you bringing that up because it's something that I think for Kay it was problematic for the beginning because it was problematic within his father. Like if Kay's father is not quite able to, um, his father's dealing, as I understand it, with quite a bit of shame, and the way he chooses to present that is like through being authoritarian, and then that kind of translates to like we're going to mosque. This is what we do. There's no sort of discussion in it, and that obviously, um, that shapes a person's relationship with religion in a particular way, uh, and then it's further complicated, of course, by 9/11 in a very tragic way, um, and and so I see Kay as even early on being confused by why he's engaging with namaz, with prayer, reading the Quran, going to mosque, um, and then it's like, and then seeing the extent and the extreme version of it within Iran, in the novel, and but when he comes back and when 9/11 happens, and there's something about like, I think for him the world telling you need to reject it, which I wonder, I think for him it's easier to resist that, and it's not true though about life. Like it's easier to reject what the world is telling you about yourself than it is to reject what your father, mother, siblings, closest friends are telling about you about yourself. So like as a young person, when it's enforced by his dad, he's like, no, don't want it, no thank you. Like, I'm only doing this because it's required. But then when America is like, you can't be this, that sort of opens up this portal to be like, wait, like my grandfather, my mother, my father, like this goes beyond me, and perhaps it can be a portal into something that I'm actually needing. And I was like very moved by the him taking himself back to mosque, and engaging with prayer on his own terms.
I think there was something about that specific action, especially at the point that it comes within the novel in which you're throughout you're seeing Kay trying to understand and organize his identity. And so much of that is dictated by external forces, by his friends, by his family, by his loved ones, and by his fears. And actually, there's a moment there in which the fears don't abandon him for a brief moment. He stops being scared and he goes towards this feeling in him that he really
Yeah.
understands. And it's so yeah, I think it's a really special kind of it's not necessarily a closing moment or a kind of he's reached an end point, but more an opening up for him, you know?
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I agree with that so much. It doesn't take away the Islamophobia, for instance, like both that's coming at him, or the desire to want to disappear, and erase that part of himself. But it is, as you said, like having, and 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 I don't know if you saw these as connected, but but because you talked about like religion and faith, I see it as like his his relationship going back to the mosque, but also when um and again this is in the last act of the book, like when he goes with Sean to the court and is meeting Sean's buddies and they're playing ball, and then when Kay gets home, like after having a conversation with one of Sean's good friends about like what is it I'm supposed to do with my life, he's really impressed that Andre is able to had gone to UCLA and had done these amazing things, was a musician, and now he sees him as a very successful person. Um, Kay takes that and he turns to God and like asks like please show me the way. And so I found that it was both in a religious sense, but also like you said within his faith.
When you were speaking about this notion of him receiving religion and this idea, this notion of God from from his father and his mother and his grandparents, I was thinking a lot about inheritances and what we receive from our parents, even when they're outspoken. I think throughout the novel, Kay is constantly asking his parents why they are like they are, whether it's
Mm,
through actions or it's through actually like vocalizing that question. And in particular, his father, there's a moment where he takes his father's wallet and finds that photo, and finds himself like questioning and asking, and I wondered if you could speak on this notion of inheritances, especially when we think of the grief of that generation of people who were reaching towards dreams and desires of themselves, but weren't always able to go towards it. And what happens when their children receive those griefs in a sense.
wow, wow. Yeah, man. Because it's on one hand, um, to receive inheritances, whether it's cultural or religious or um, other kinds of identities, that in and of itself sort of opens up this eh, lifelong pathway. And I think for Kay in particular, there's definitely that fact, but there's also like he doesn't know what those inheritances are because um, Maman and Baba and even some family members in Iran, and they're not quite because of years of like you said, grievances and oppression and fear of losing their life. They're not able to necessarily articulate it to themselves or feel safe to, and so it's not able to get passed on to Kay and to his brothers. And I think that like really further complicates Kay's relationship to these different identities. I have uh, friends who are part of whether it's the kids of the Iranian diaspora or of other ethnic groups, and it's interesting whenever I see if they grew up in a household where those cultures were celebrated. It's a very
Yes.
different relationship that they're able to have with themselves moving forward. And um, to this day, it's like those are questions I'm still asking myself. Like, what is my relationship to my Iranianness? What is my relationship to Islam? What is to queerness? Like, um, we'll find out.
We find out. I don't think we ever get there. You just keep asking more questions, right? You just going round and round in a circle. I feel like whenever whenever I'm sitting down to write, especially when I think of writing a novel, it's like there are these questions that are really pulsing at you that
Mm,
are they're often quite central to you, and you come to the end and the questions usually haven't been resolved, but you've taken
yeah,
some sort of journey towards them, perhaps towards more questioning.
I guess one thing that is critical, and it's lovely to hear you say that, Caleb, because I think in order to begin that process, one has to be willing and sort of and also accept that they are deserving to ask those questions. Like there's no permission slip where somebody can say, um, no, because your relationship, let's say like with Kay, like, no, you were born in the States and then you went to Iran and you came back and like therefore um, you're severed from that part of
Mhm.
you. It's like it requires of Kay to say, I'm deserving to ask who my parents are, where they come from, the impact that has on me. Um, but I feel like if we don't accept that within ourselves, then we don't really stand a chance to begin that process. And we can't wait for somebody to be like, I grant you permission to begin asking questions.
Mhm. I think I think there's a point actually where I was thinking of what was the question that was running, or questions that were running through this novel.
Mm,
And
mm,
um, there was a section of the novel in around where Kay is talking to his aunt, and at night, and she's reading him from a Forugh. Um, and there's a section of the poem that she reads, which I wrote down so I wasn't mess it up. But
mm.
um, she reads, do you know what I want of life? That I can be with you, all of you. And for me, this section really was an echo of the novel's intentions of the going towards the self and the questioning of the self, and asking the permission, giving yourself permission to ask these questions. And I kind of wanted to ask what that specific section meant to you, and why using it in that space, in that context.
Yeah, there I that it's such a pivotal moment of the book. Like perhaps when I look at it now, like maybe the pivotal moment in the book, because there are so many threads at play. And um on one hand, like just on a very sort of even on simple level, like even his aunt having Farouk's book in her possession, which
Mm,
like, within the current regime is not allowed and could be very dangerous, because Farouk is talking about sexual desire and wanting and belonging and identity. Um, so that alone, for me, really excited to be able to experience the aunt who um, is bringing this to Kay, where unbeknownst, well, I think the aunt is somewhat aware of the violences he's had to endure, but not entirely.
mm,
And so for him to witness this, and to receive language that speaks to what he's experiencing, and also um, through her identity as a poet, I think that alone
mm,
also speaks to him. And then Kay is able to, I think, with his aunt, it's the first time in the novel where he's able to really sit with somebody and feel safe enough to not only ask questions about his own mother or their family, but to also trust that like the space will be given to him, respectfully, and as thoroughly as his aunt is able to. Like for her own safety, there are certain things that she sort of doesn't say explicitly to him, but I think just that interaction, um, and and it was also, I think, important for me to show how like womanhood and feminism essentially saved this boy's life, gave
mm.
him a chance to emerge somewhat intact with something to hold on to, like whether it's a poem or his aunt's physical presence, like that sort of gave him just enough to be able to move on.
I also wanted to ask actually about Brooks' words are the title of the novel, and also are one of the kind of opening words that you read. And I wanted to ask about their specific influence on this novel, and your work in general.
It was amazing, Caleb, because Isabel and I, like we've Isabel Wall, my editor for this book, the editor that we both have, she and I would tell I would tell her about how much I enjoy just like having Farouk's book with me and going through the poems and
Mhm.
um, finding both like lines, but also the titles themselves that really speak to me. And then when it came time for finding the title for the manuscript, I both Isabel and I, and also Parissa here in the States, like we're like, I feel like Faroukh's gonna she's gonna show us the way. Like she she has such a strong um, role in the book, and it feels only right that she'll also give us the title. And so it was just a matter of like going through her poems, and it was Parsa who saw I Will Greet the Sun Again. It's like, and it's so interesting, Caleb, that like that never even occurred to me. I wanted there's a beautiful just line in one of the poems that I love where she describes love as her love in blue. And to me, like I love the feelings that that brings up for me. And and yet when I zoomed out and look at like being in Isfahan, being in Los Angeles, being in the Valley, there's so the sun does such a strong like both literal presence and then figurative presence. And the hopefulness of I will greet the sun again hasn't happened, but I'm trusting that it will. It
Yeah.
was like that felt perfect for it.
Yeah. Were there were there other writers, Farouk, and I'm assuming Baldwin, but aside from that, who influenced the writing of this novel?
You know, Caleb, I always have a tough time with that question
Mhm,
because I didn't grow up reading or writing. I came
mhm,
to it
mhm,
sort of somewhat later,
mhm,
and I bring that up because if you love something as much as I really I really love language with all of me, and the reason I say that is like if you really love something and then you see other people doing that in such a high level, I, I think everybody's going to kind of become an influence, you know. And so like when I'm going through bookstores or hearing of new writers, like I've talked about what your work has meant to me, and each person fills fills a certain slot, and you get to take away from them. So it's like, yeah, there's, you know, Baldwin, and I'm looking at my stack of books here, and it just I don't ever really. I'm curious to hear you. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you approach reading, because it's something that I'm like, I don't think I figured out how to like engage with other authors in a way that feels more intentional. I guess I'm like kind of a little boy. Like I go to the bookstore, I'm like, I'll take anything and everyone, you know, like you show me the way. And how is that for you though, when it comes to literary influences and what you're reading?
Man, I'm kind of like you. Like I keep like keep starting stacks of books that I'm going to start and end up just like going through a few of them and rifling through, but that's brilliant and feeling like I just want to absorb everything. Um, like I think so much of the time, especially when I'm writing, like I'm doing books around me constantly because so much of I wear so many of my influences on my sleeve. Um, I think it's another way for me to show and express love because I like you, I love language and so many of my literary influences, whether that's in book form or in song form and spoken word form, like for me, everything becomes an influence. Everyone's rhythm is able to influence mine. But reading wise, I think I also go through rhythms as well. When I'm writing, it's so much of it is like laser focused, and it feels like
Yeah.
everything is relevant to the novel. But when I'm not, I'm a little bit more sprawling, and I just kind of allow myself to encounter everything and anything.
Yeah, yeah, and you're bringing to mind like so on one hand there's a novel called We the Animals by Justin Torres, and for me reading that book, um I had read it when I had first moved to New York when I was
Mhm,
26, and I bring that up because it's a story. The narrator is coming of age. He's queer. He's the youngest
mhm,
of three brothers. Um, complicated dynamics with the mother and father in the household, deals with like um, incredible hardship, and reading that book um, showed me that um, sort of showed me that it was okay to write about the things that I wanted to write about. So that sort of gave me um, an example to turn to, and I think in addition to that, one thing that was like sort of a heartbreak for me is because of the diaspora, because of the current state of what's happening in Iran, and so many artists, and I'm not saying this like with hyperbole, like murdered,
Yeah.
for writing, for creating.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I'm, let's say, for me, like wanting to turn to an Iranian writer to feel a kind of kinship and community, um, it was really hard to find titles that deal with like in contemporary Iran, because there's so few. There's like the literature from the era of the Shah and before that, but I really wanted and needed something that spoke to contemporary life, um, and that's where film really played the role, because although Iranian filmmakers are being incarcerated and their lives are being threatened, like several of them continue to create against all odds, and having the visual of the sounds and the sights of Iran, and feeling that kind of kinship, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is an Iranian artist, and
Yeah.
I want to aspire to that, and I feel that we share lineage, we share heritage, and so
Mhm.
therefore that really gave me that encouragement. And I don't know if I would be able to have done that without. I always tell people like music, film, going to museum, and like
Yeah.
engaging with
Yeah.
art in different mediums
Yeah.
really helps me.
I think there is something about allowing the work to be about more than just strictly language and literature with capital L. It's like it's expanding beyond the point and actually allowing all of your influences and all of your loves to make their way and show up in your work, you know?
Well, because Caleb, like and I don't know if you relate to this, but the community that I grew up in and the friends that I had, like, um, and the books that we were assigned to read and told to read, uh, it wasn't about us, it didn't reflect our experiences, and so
Mm.
I feel like it would be dishonest and a disservice. Not that there's anything wrong with like writing in more of a classical or traditional sense. Like I don't even know what language to use to describe that, because as a young person I felt it was so inaccessible to me. Um,
Mm.
but to then have put that expectation on myself to
Mhm.
be like, you need to write in the way that as a young person you didn't connect to or you didn't see yourself in, would be kind of going against the whole thing of like why I wanted to become a writer.
For sure, for sure. I think when you're talking about community, there's a part in the novel when the brothers are in Iran and they're driving and I have a look, I think it's on my copy anyway, on page 98, where they say we still have this life to enjoy, wouldn't you agree?
Mm,
And it really
hmm.
emphasized this notion of gathering and of community as refusal and as resistance in the face of violence, both personal and communal. And I wondered what community means to you and what freedom is to be found in it.
It's yeah, that I think I specifically remember like getting really choked up when I was writing that scene that you pointed out, because I was so moved um by by people who understand um what can be taken and what has been taken, and yet are still going into public spaces to gather and to
Mhm.
celebrate life.
Mhm.
Um and for me, I think I try to apply that as well. It's interesting, Caleb, like especially with with queerness and being out, like and right now I live in San Francisco, and I have sort of privileges and relative and freedoms that like other communities don't have,
mm,
and I recognize that, and I also am terrified
mm,
about being attacked, or for different reasons, and um, so I think that's a constant negotiation of like, yes, that exists and that's a reality, but at the same time, I'm not going to allow that to disappear or go back into myself, even if it has happened, in the past, where like somebody has done something truly awful. It's like, well, for that person who's done something awful, there are also enormous amount of other people who are willing to embrace and love
mm.
and be in community with me. And so I tried to gravitate towards that.
Got a couple more questions. I could talk about this full evening, but I wanted to I wanted to ask about that instance that you mentioned earlier when Justin is kind of really hurting and
Mm.
is talking not just about sex, but is also really talking about love. Um, I think you're right that Justin's the only one to who's willing to show me what it looks like when you love. I think so many of the sentences and the pages of this novel are real expressions of love, and I wondered what love currently means to you.
Wow, wow. I think it goes back to the gesture that we were talking about earlier, with like what Kay is willing to do with
Mm,
Johnny, to continuously show up and sit beside him and listen, and to me, today, that's what love means, whether it's with a friend or with a family member, whoever it may be, a partner. It's like
mm,
I'm willing to, against all odds, because let's be honest, like there's madness that's going on around us, right, Caleb? In the world, every day it's something, and we can kind of list off all the things that are, at least I'll speak for myself. There are many things that I can see myself wanting to protect myself and not show up in love. But when I'm sitting with a friend, and I'm listening, and I'm speaking from my heart, it's like it's happened. I'm like, there it is. Like
mm,
this is an act of um it's an act of revolution to
yeah,
be able to
yeah.
show up and make that gesture. So that's what love means to me today, is continuing um to make the gesture to show up.
And I think lastly, although you may have already answered my question, when readers have finished with your novel, what do you want them to feel?
I wrote this for us, that's really what started me in writing this, and um, even if there are differences in the communities we came up in, or class or race, I feel with the kind of voice that I hope to bring to the page, and the yeah, I just want I want I would hope that readers would feel like this was, it's like, oh, he wrote this for us.
Um, thank you so much for writing this novel first and foremost, and for taking the time with me tonight. Uh, it's really wonderful to have your work in the
Mm.
world, and I hope you feel proud. I hope you really do feel proud. I would encourage everyone to go and buy this wonderful novel. I will greet the sun again. Cash, thank you so much, man.
Such a pleasure, Caleb.